Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome. For those of you that don't know, my name is Jackie Stacey. I'm Director of CIDRAL, Centre for Interdisciplinary Research in the Arts and Languages. And our theme this semester, as I think many of you know because you've been to several of the events, is Sensing the Arts. And I'm just going to say a few words about the theme before I introduce tonight's speaker. Our speakers so far in this series have included Adam Phillips, Denise Riley, Susan Stewart, Jack Halberstam and Charles Zika. And we have two more events, one in May and one in June. One on Annette Kuhn's, it'll be a roundtable on Annette Kuhn's book, Little Madnesses, Winnicott and the Imagination. And it'll be actually a short lecture by Annette Kuhn, followed by a roundtable discussion of the book. And then the closing lecture will be by Dick Hebditch from Birmingham Cultural Studies renown. There's also a series of collaborations with Home, the new arts centre incorporating Corner House and the Library Theatre. And there are I won't go into all the detail of those events in June now, but they're all on the CIDRAL website as well as on the Home website. And the collaborations are around this theme, Sensing the Arts. And I just wanted to pause for a moment and thank Clara Bradbury-Rance for all her hard work on the CIDRAL website as well as helping to organise these events. So thank you, Clara. We've chosen this theme, Sensing the Arts, as a way of thinking about how the senses have come into recent academic frames through debates about the body and its affects and discussions about the pleasures and difficulties of living with and through various affective states. The senses, in the context that we've been addressing them, can be understood in both physiological and psychic ways, and often the kind of combination of the two. Throughout the series, we've examined the historical and cultural dynamics between perception and aesthetics across the arts. And tonight's speaker, Elisabeth E.Bronfen, could not be better qualified to speak about these concerns, as her work has combined literary, film, artistic and theoretical readings of representations of the body and its affects. She's published on hysteria, on the femme fatale and on the diva, on death and mortality and war. She's Professor of English and American Studies at the University of Zurich, and since 2007 she's also Global Distinguished Professor at New York University. A specialist in 19th and 20th century literature, Elisabeth's also written articles in the areas of gender studies, psychoanalysis, film, cultural theory and visual culture. She did her PhD at the University of Munich on literary space in the work of Dorothy Richardson's novel Pilgrimage, as well as her habilitation on representations of femininity and death, which became her highly influential book, published by Manchester University Press, and I'm pleased to see that Manchester University Press are with us in the room. Matthew Frost's here with us. So that was published by Manchester University Press, and the book was titled Over Her Dead Body, Death, Femininity and the Aesthetic. And I know many people here were very influenced by that book, which really did travel across the disciplines in a way that makes her perfect speaker for CIDRAL this evening. Her most recent of many books is Night Passages, Philosophy, Literature and Film, published by Columbia University Press in 2013. And in addition to her many publications, if you go to Elisabeth's website, she's also something of a public intellectual in a way that's actually very unusual in Britain, but she's been interviewed in the media, she's written in newspapers, been interviewed in newspapers, and you can actually see some of those interviews, both videos and the written interviews, via her website. So she's really a very dynamic and publicly engaged intellectual, as well as a very prolific writer. I recently had the pleasure of editing an article by Elisabeth for the Screen Journal, and it was on the use of rear projection in Hitchcock's cinema. And I have to say, it was really such a pleasure editing writing that combines her precision with an expansive scope, and I think that's her trademark in a way. Tomorrow's masterclass, for those of you that are interested, will be tomorrow 10 till 12 here in University Place at 3.213, room 3.213 here in University Place. And it'll be a dialogue between Elisabeth Bronfen and Anna Carden-Coyne, who's just joined us from history, on sensing war in cinema and art. And we're actually going to be reading sections from Elisabeth's book, Spectres of War, Hollywood's Engagement with Military Conflict, and also the catalogue from the Sensory War 1914 to 2014, edited and written by Anna Carden-Coyne and others. So we're going to sort of bring, and those readings are available on the CIDRAL website. So we're going to sort of bring into dialogue these two different approaches to sensing the arts, and you're very welcome to join us tomorrow 10 till 12 here in University Place. So tonight's lecture, as you can see, is entitled Gendering War Dispatches, Martha Gellhorn, Lee Miller and Margaret Bourke-White on World War II front lines. And please join me in giving Elisabeth Bronfen a very warm welcome.
So first of all, Jackie, thank you for having invited me. We know each other as authors, and then when you get to meet an author in reality, it's sometimes tricky, but this has been lovely. I am presenting material which I put together and which is coming out in a German version, should be out already, but it isn't out already, because we are quote unquote celebrating, commemorating 60 years V-Day in Europe. That is called in German 0 hour, or the hour zero, where everything starts again. And that was what got me interested in looking once more, in this case particularly the female war correspondent. And I'm beginning with this image because this is probably my interest here now in the feminine gaze in war zones. This is probably the image that we connect most readily with Lee Miller's engagement during World War II. We see her here in Hitler's bathtub. What's important to bear in mind is that she set it up this way. This is not probably the way his bathroom looked. She placed this figurine here and his photograph here. We see her having neatly put her uniform here, including her cap, also very neatly her watch, the boots fairly neatly here as well, except that the mat in front of the bathtub is soiled. Otherwise, the room is absolutely pristine. The pose suggests a kind of calm in between war zones, but it also invokes iconographically Susanna in the bath. Because we see her looking up to signal that she knows she knows that she's being watched. And the man who took the photograph, David E. Sherman, who was both her partner and her sometime lover, tells the story that in fact the reason why she looked up like that was because another officer was banging on the door, soap and towel in hand, because he too wanted to take a bath. However, the situation in itself dodgy, because we have her literally inside, touching with her most intimate skin. That's where the sensuality comes into play. Touching intimately the site of the Führer's cleansing, I'm not going to go into more than that, becomes even more curious when we look at the contact sheets. Because when we do so, we see that there's something both frivolous and aggressive going on. It's not just that Sherman photographs her in various poses, but that David Sherman himself, having photographed her, got into the bathtub as well. And if you look more closely at this image, I just wanted you to see many, thus you're not getting a good image, but you can see that the pile of clothes is higher. So what we're to assume is that she didn't actually put her uniform back on. The only thing that she is probably wearing as she is photographing him are her boots, because these are now his. What I'm interested in here is that this is a strange, victorious occupation of the intimacy of the enemy. It seems to function as a testament to his capitulation. Miller published under the title Hitleriana in Vogue in the summer of 1945 the text Hitleriana, which begins with the sentence, "I was living in Hitler's private apartment in Munich when his death was announced." And indeed, this is truly what she was doing. We have Sherman photographing her in the various places, in the bed, sitting at his living table, I don't know what, sitting at in the living room, etc. What I'm and in fact, sorry, this is she had been following she had been going along with the 179th Regiment of the 45th Division. They took over his residence in Munich, and that's where they were. If you look at more of the images, we see that they're all living in this place. I'm tempted to call this an uncanny sight, a kind of reminder of absent monstrosity, because as she writes to her editor Audrey Withers of Vogue, and now I quote her, "Hitler had never been alive for me until today. He'd been an evil machine monster all these years until I ate and slept in his room. He became less fabulous and therefore more terrible, along with a little evidence of his having some almost human habits." And I'm sorry for animal studies people now, but she does say, "like an ape who embarrasses and humbles you with his gestures, mirroring yourself in caricature." I'm particularly interested in the idiosyncratic gesture that's inscribed in this testimony, because her bodily performance of occupying Hitler's apartment, and that's, as I say, where the sensuality comes into play, is a documentation of the fact that he no longer inhabits this location. She couldn't do that if he were still there. Her doing it marks he's not there anymore. That is to say, as a survivor, by this point he has committed suicide, she physically and figuratively takes over his home. That is, she displaces him from his home. The everyday objects she touches appear as relics of a past political era. So we could call this a kind of celebration of the demise of the Führer, a kind of gesture of exorcism. And indeed representative for the entire homeland, the spirit of Hitler is to be driven out of this home. And yet, to the end, her gaze, and this is very typical for Lee Miller, will be unforgiving. In the final photoreportage that she sends from Germany, now occupied by the Allied forces, she also writes, "I don't think they'll ever learn, and I know that I will never understand them. I'm just like the soldiers here who look at the beautiful countryside, use the super modern comforts of their buildings, and wonder why the Germans wanted anything more." Equally important for what I got interested in was that Lee Miller was not the only war correspondent who used her celebrity to report the war, and that she herself photographed two of them. The portrait of Bourke-White bears the title "At the Other End of the Lens," and it's taken for Vogue at an American Air Force base in England, 1942. It shows the co-founder of Life magazine under the wing of one of the B-17 bombers, in which she would be, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, where she would be the first woman photographer to fly combat missions. What I want to draw your attention to is the visual correspondence between the camera in her hand and this bathtub machine gun housing, which military people tell me house the bombardiers themselves. So there's a double shooting going on here in this image, and it bears the inscription "A belly full," where the wordplay, of course, inverts the idiom into a warning. The belly-like sight of the bombardier is full, even while this also refers to Bourke-White's sense of purpose, because she has everything but a belly full of war, and her camera is always filled with film. So that's what I'm saying, the shooting, she's going to shoot images of the shooting coming out of that, this belly-like structure. For another article for Vogue, published 43, this time on women in news reporting, Miller photographs Martha Gellhorn. And here we have a different site of operation, because what would normally be a vanity table in a hotel room has been turned into a desk. As you can see, it's covered with books and papers and her portable typewriter, but I'm also interested in the way that she's turned it seemingly into a kind of altar for her husband, Ernest Hemingway, who, like her, was covering the war for colliers. If you then go into the visual archive, you find that in fact a very similar type of staging can be found in this cover for Harper's Bazaar that Dahl-Wolf did for the autumn edition. Here we see a woman in front of her vanity table mirror. Her uniform is prominently displayed. We see the badge for the American Women's Voluntary Services. She's cast aside for her elegant evening gown. We only see her from the back. That's important, but equally important is that her face is mirrored. The mirrored face we see is covered over to a certain degree by the picture of her loved one and the correspondence that he is sending back from the front. The ideological point is clear. We have the stylish American woman. She is to be interested in fashion even though the war is going on, and yet the war is always on the fringe of her perception. Even as she looks at herself in the mirror, she sees insignia of the war. If we then look again at the photograph that Lee Miller makes of Martha Gellhorn, we also notice the seminal difference, because Martha Gellhorn is facing us and she's holding her finished report. That is to say, she's not only turning her back on the mirror, but she's also turning her back on her husband, who, like her, as I said, is a war correspondent for, among others, colliers. And furthermore, she's not lost in thought, but she's looking directly into the camera. She's not dreaming of her loved one fighting on foreign soil. She is herself in the war zone. At the same time, and that's why I think the visual connection is so interesting, the stories that she's writing about her experiences on the front are precisely for women like the one on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. Gellhorn became known for drawing attention particularly to the collateral damages of war. She always said, I liked visiting hospitals because that's where you see what war does to people. She wanted to draw attention particularly to the cost of war. She was interested in enlisting empathy from her readers for something, and this is the other point I want to emphasize for Martha Gellhorn, for something they had no direct knowledge of. And so again, the ideological point is clear, inspired by the report which Martha Gellhorn is holding in her hands. She's appealing to the imaginary capacity of her readers. What only becomes interesting, or what only becomes visible once you see the images next to each other, is that we can also see something else happening in this photograph. There seems to be a kind of mutual recognition at play. This seems to be almost an oblique portrait of Lee Miller herself, because she, in a sense, is authorizing both her own and Martha Gellhorn's authority. The claim they're making to presenting their own very specific, very singular, very subjective representations of what they're experiencing on the war front. So although we have three different locations, the bathroom of the enemy, an airbase, and a hotel room, what I want to present to you is a kind of line of connection that I came to discover between these three correspondents. Clearly, the attitude with which they go into the war and the attitude with which they write about the war is different. One could say that for Lee Miller, it was primarily an accidental opportunity that opened up because she happened to be, and she happens to be over and over again, in the right place at the right time. It gave her the chance to use her celebrity. People knew her as the model, as Steichen's model, as Man Ray's model. They also knew her as a fashion photographer for high-gloss New York magazines. It gave her, in a sense, the opportunity to do something for a cause that she was passionate about, namely defeating fascism in Europe. For Bourke-White, on the other hand, as I said, co-founder of Life, this was really a continuation of what she'd already been doing in the 30s, writing about the migrants in the American South. And Bourke-White, people would have known Bourke-White as the woman poised on the gargoyle outside the Chrysler building as she's trying to photograph, and an insane picture anyway, getting a really good top shot of America, New York. She didn't mind sitting on that gargoyle. So she was kind of known as this audacious, professional woman insisting on positioning herself in the front lines of women photographers before she then goes into this war. Martha Gellhorn, of course, discovered a passion for war and found herself drawn time and again into war zones, particularly because, as I've already said, she was interested in rendering imaginable what in fact is incomprehensible about the horror of war. So the line of connection I want to draw for you between these three celebrity correspondents, and that's what's important for me. All three were already celebrities before they go to war, and they use celebrity and the whole physicality of that celebrity as part and parcel of their reportage. It's what that then does to the testimony they give to us. Because my point here is that in all three cases, it's important that they're not just physically present, but that we see them physically present. That the charisma that is connected with them as stars is part and parcel of the war stories that they have to tell. Now, there isn't enough time to go into great depth, but just a few words about the situation of women in war reporting. And because I think it's interesting to remember, and now I'm talking about the American news situation, that I don't think it's all that different from the British, but I could be wrong here. This is the American situation, which is that well into the 70s, it was a masculine-dominated arena. Nevertheless, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. War Department officially accredited 127 women. That's unusual. That's the first time that happened. And among them were people like Sonia Tamara and Margaret Higgins, who reported for the Herald Tribune, Ann O'Hare for the New York Times, Helen Kirkpatrick for the Chicago Daily News, and Sigrid Schultz for the Chicago Tribune. So they were reporting for key newspapers. They gained traction because, as John Ostraker, then the director of International News Services, explained, they were in places where their male colleagues were not. And they were sending a lot of useful copy and a lot of useful images. And so one could say that the Second World War is almost like a watershed, even though during the Vietnam War there would be less women correspondents on the ground than during the 40s. But the 40s, in a sense, mark a moment, and that's part of what I'm trying to show you with the images and the material in a moment again. It's, in a sense, one could say that women like Gellhorn, Bourke-White, and Miller were extremely influential in selling the war to the American audience, precisely because they were part of the story that they were telling. That's why this worked, and that again was so compelling because they were really fighting on two fronts. They were fighting against the prejudice that the American military had against women being anywhere close to the front lines, and they were fighting against the fascist enemy. And that meant that they turned all the constraints imposed upon them into their advantage, using many interesting tricks and ploys to come up with a uniquely feminine take on the war. And what we need to bear in mind, for this is specific to the Second World War, because obviously propaganda is involved, nevertheless, this is in great contrast both to the catastrophe of the First World War, which so much has been written about recently again, and any other subsequent American military engagements, precisely because World War II was perceived then and is still now perceived as the one just and justified war in the 20th century from the Allied point of view. So that even while all the American correspondents were part of the military apparatus, they were given uniforms, they were given gear, they were, if they were lucky, which Miller was not, given a jeep. They were even given the status of captain in case they were captured. All of the material they wrote had to pass the censor. And they, in a sense, they all, in retrospect, they sometimes say it was kind of naive of us, but they all basically stood behind the type of ideological position that came from the War Department. But what I am, in a sense, more interested in than just this question of self-censorship is the fact that along with news magazines like Life and Look. It was particularly women's fashions magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar that were important for documenting and in fact for getting the American audience to support the war. Vogue never did that before, and Vogue is not doing that today. But Vogue was the place where some of the, and precisely because of Lee Miller, some of the harshest and bleakest and most ostentatious war reporting was in fact going on. And indeed, within the context again of news media, you have to bear in mind that photo reportage was something comparatively new in the 30s. So one could even say, maybe cynically, maybe not, that this was the moment where life, it's not just that Life was the place where so much of the war photo reportage was being done, but in fact, the war also made Life as an important site for photojournalism. So we have two ambivalences that I just want us to bear in mind as before we move into the three case studies I want to present to you. Firstly, given this embedding of the journalists within the war, incredibly complicated war machinery on the part of the American military, we have this balance between personal ambition and self-censorship. We want to do that, we feel we need to do that, we feel politically, patriotically compelled, but we must accept the censor. And there's a constant self-reflection on that. The second thing that's equally important to me, to bring in a few more theoretical concepts, I talk about a kind of double vision here, because the people reporting are giving an eyewitness report to people who are not there. They have to re-encode the experiences on the front into the language of the civilian population whom they want to give this information to and whom they want to influence. So we're always talking about a form of framing. And the framing is not just the cadrage that's chosen. The framing is the subtitles, the framing is the stories, and of course the framing is also, and you'll see this in a moment, the framing is how these images are placed on the page of the magazines. So we have this curious tension between, on the one hand, taking back literally, there is death adhering to these images because they're in a war zone. What they're photographing isn't just there, it is, all of these are examples of destruction, death, violence, and the women making these photographs are themselves in danger. And at the same time, all of this is only possible because it is aesthetically refigured. And it is precisely because of the connection between the personal and the historical that we're seeing, the real and its framing. It's because of that connection and not despite of it that I think this work is so effective. So I want first to talk about, in a little more detail, Lee Miller. As I say, she was the woman who always knew how to turn opportunity in her favor. She was in London living with Anthony Penrose when the war broke out, and so she used the kind of what I call a murky interface between her surrealist art attitude and fashion photography and war she found in order to work, in this case now, the images I have here are a book that she put together by Ernestine Carter called Grim Glory, Pictures of Britain Under Fire, meant to sustain British morale. And I'm fascinated with the way that she produces these extraordinary images of the bombed streets of London and discovering there, in the case of this typewriter, kind of macabre ready-mades. Or here, this is the bombed court in London college, where we see the kind of lovely reflection of the dome in the pool. This image is called Revenge of Culture, where we see an angel, in a sense, still intact amidst ruins. And this wonderful image, it says here, "Please take me away." It's almost as though she was turning the bombed streets of London into some kind of macabre war comedy. But what's equally compelling about Lee Miller is that she's the first photographer to actually not just see bombed London as an aesthetic ready-made site, but to take her models into the streets of London. This is all for British Vogue. At this point, she's not writing copy, she's just making photographs. And here you have a mixture of wit and a kind of a classic modernist visual style. If you look at the visual analogy between the material of her cloth and the bomb buildings behind her, she'd been doing a lot of that. This is already in 1939, where she aligns the model with military gear and a huge world map behind her. And this one is called the Choice of the Month. This is 1943. These are Fortnum Mason baskets that no longer contain fruit or food, but just white paper, and we can start imagining what that white paper might stand for. This one is called All Change, 1942, where we see a visual analogy in the fabric, but it's a kind of elegance plus recycling. And here, 1943, this is the woman surrounded by news. News is everywhere. So again, the ideological point is clear. The readers of British Vogue were meant to remain fashionable, and at the same time, they were also meant to be absolutely aware of the events, the news events happening. This alliance, and this is what I got interested in, the alliance between women's fashions and military look. This isn't just unique to Lee Miller, obviously, because the whole fashion industry had started to do that. And so I just thought I'd show you a couple of covers made by Louise Bourke. I make mistakes all the time. She's called Doll Wolf. She's the one who photographs this for Harper's Bazaar. Here we see the model in front of Navy costumes. Here we see her in front of posters to buy war bonds. Here the furred lady in front of the flags of the Allies. Here in front of a defense poster. And here standing in front, Lauren Bacall-esque standing in front of a Red Cross door. And even more radical, perhaps, just two images by Constantine Jaffe, where he uses the woman to then suddenly look like some kind of land continent mirrored, but above all, holding up the newspaper. And I'm also interested in the fact that he mixes colored photography with black and white, and most stunning, this photograph, Italy craters, she's reading about the craters, she's in color, the news are in black and white. And if one then looks for it, we see that Lee Miller continued, even while she was photographing the front, she also continues to photograph fashion. On furlough in Paris, after Paris was liberated, she does a story on the cultural life that continues to flourish in Paris. I think this is pretty spectacular. These are American women troops in a fashion show in Paris, fondly touching the fabric, and we can have fantasies about what else. And in 1944, she's also on the streets again of bombed Paris now, photographing for Lisa Schiaparelli. But what I found even more interesting is that it's not just that she takes her models to the streets and that she continues to do and is part of this bizarre alliance between fashion and military attire. And even more, she takes the home front women and turns them into glamour girls. Again, there's context for that. There are film shorts, American film shorts, that call them the glamour girls of 1943. That's the American home front. In this case, this is a photo stretch that she did for Vogue 43 called Nightlife Now. And what we see here is the way that she stages them and the way that she lights them makes the war effort into a kind of other theatrical scene. I mean, there's an incredible amount of pathos in something like this, where they're literally lit by what is also lighting the sky so that they can discover the German planes. And this is the most famous one, because of course this one is called Women with Fire Masks. It's taken literally on her, this is her bomb shelter. And we can't quite know whether this is supposed to be an advertisement for military gear or a surrealist game with identities. And just again, a bit of context, it's important to remember, and Audrey Withers has commented on that afterwards, how unusual it was for Vogue to do this and how grateful they were, in a sense. They only realized afterwards, once she'd started, not just photographing for them, but also writing for them. Lee Miller's contribution to Vogue during the war made what would otherwise have been a frivolous fashion magazine into a serious place. And I'm interested in precisely the, what I call murky interface between fashion, war effort, and a reportage which was never just beautiful. Once she moved onto the front lines, what's important here is that she did this, and you'll see this is true for all of them. This is the first reportage she wrote for Vogue, Unarmed Warriors. It's about a hospital just behind Omaha Beach. And newsworthy is not just what she writes about that hospital, but also the fact that she is writing about it. So it's the way that she's selling herself physically as the witness there, and it's the only one in Vogue that has her photograph. So she's installed as the war correspondent by virtue of an image of her as a war correspondent. And that's particularly interesting to me. Not just is she wearing the standard Eisenhower jacket, but you can see the helmet is quite large, and it was designed especially for her so that she could put her camera inside that helmet. And so we have, I mean, she's really staging herself. That's my point. Even while she's writing these really gruesome texts, as you'll hear in a moment, we have lots of images of her, many of them done by David Sherman. Here, for example, emphasizing her femininity, I am assuming. Here, standing next to what is most important to war correspondents, namely cigarettes and benzene to get around, gasoline to get around. This, of course, is the most famous of the photographs he did of her. This is where we have her in her double role. On the one hand, the photograph recollects the fact that that people know her as this incredibly beautiful model in the images by Man Ray, and at the same time it anticipates her new role as war correspondent, doing so in front of a cover of Vogue. The surrealist gaze that I've been invoking underwrites these extremely personal essays that she sends back to Audrey Withers from the front, which include unflinching details of war's destruction. And I only want to focus on one entitled The Siege of Saint-Malo. Audrey Withers was so taken with this piece that she published the entire thing, all 8 pages with 13 photographs, and she did so literally in front of the photo stretch for the autumn fashion of that year. Miller herself, and all of these 3 women are quite self-ironic. Miller herself called this her own private war because no one was there but she. This is a good example for women being where all the male correspondents are not, because everyone thought, oh, well, Saint-Malo, no one is in Saint-Malo. Well, they were wrong. The Nazis had barricaded themselves in the citadel, and a particularly bloody siege took place. This is how she begins, and I want you now just to hear a little bit the prose with which she brings the front to her Vogue readers. This is both British and American Vogue. I thumbed a ride on an LST to the siege of Saint-Malo. I brought my bed, I begged my board, and I was given a grandstand view of fortress warfare reminiscent of Crusader times. I'd thought that watching a battle from a hillside had gone out with the glamorous paintings of Napoleon. So we have this reference to traditional war painting. This is her entrance point. And one of her first descriptions of the soldiers that are going to, after ceasefire, going to go back to fight, recalls her fashion fantasy. She writes, a company of soldiers was filing out of Saint-Malo, ready to go into action, grenades hanging on their lapels like Cartier clips, menacing bunches of death. But then what follows is a minute description of the battle, the arrival of the Air Force, the artillery bombardment, and then the slow move of these tiny little infantrymen up the hill. And I find it compelling the way she imagines herself into their situation. She writes, and they were earth-colored like the burned soil they were traversing. I projected myself into their struggle, my arms and legs aching and cramped. The first man scrambled over the sharp edge, went along a bit, and turned back to give a hand in hauling up the others. On and on the men went, veering off to the right. It was awesome and marrow-freezing. And then her reportage moves into real time, because she goes on, the building we were in and all the others which faced the fort were being shot at now. Ping, bang, hitting above our window, into the next, breaking on the balcony below. Fast, rapid, queer noise. I mean, this sounds almost like Virginia Woolf. Impact before the gun noise itself, following the same sound pattern, hundreds of rounds, crossing and recrossing where we were. The GIs are not able to make it up the citadel, so the poor kids have to come back down. I mean, some of them don't, of course. But they leave an indelible impression on her mind, because she then continues, they were in front of me on the floor, the blackboard, on the posters, on the ceiling, higher and higher everywhere I looked. So in a sense, even though she's not seeing them anymore, she's still seeing them in her mind. And that's precisely the capacity, the imaginary capacity that she wants to invoke in her readers. And so this is why I'm talking about a kind of double perspective, which she takes from history painting. You get the panorama view, and then you get the individual details. And at the same time, we have the real sensual touch of war as well. She has to flee her room because there's more gunfire. And as she hides in, she tries to hide in a kind of shelter. And there she suddenly realizes, my heel ground into a dead, detached hand. And I cursed the Germans for the sordid, ugly destruction they had conjured up in this once beautiful town. I picked up the hand and hurled it across the street and ran back the way I'd come, bruising my feet and crashing into the unsteady piles of stones, and slipped in blood. Christ, it was awful. So you have this religious, the historical invocation, and at the same time the absolute viscerality of her part of the body bits and pieces lying around Saint-Malo. And again, typical for her, seizing an unexpected opportunity, she was able to witness the first use of napalm in the Second World War. She makes this famous photograph, which I'm interested in again because of the question of framing. And this is obviously a perfectly, beautifully composed shot. And the composition is such that it almost makes this explosion a kind of image within the image. My interest here is that that by virtue of this extremely aesthetic framing, it's not that it takes away from the impact, but I would want to argue it enhances the impact of what it is that she is presenting to the American audience. You can be assured that the military was not happy with that, and they tried to punish her, but that didn't really go very far. She continued to travel with the First Big Army until obviously she landed in, she went with the 83rd Airborne through Alsace, Ardennes, all the way to the Elbe. She was in Germany until she finally was in Munich and ended up even in Hitler's the house in Berchtesgaden. This is an image of her, which I find interesting because the soldiers are all attracted, of course, by the star reporter, but she is horrified, looking out to something that we can't even see, that kind of endpoint or non-representation ability of war. And just one example for what it looks like when she's in Germany after the Nazi government capitulates. She goes right back to where she was when she was in London during the Blitzkrieg. Here now, again, it's almost like ready-mades that she sees on the street. This image is called New Street Signs. So we have the new military street signs, but they're just covering up and making thus visible the old German street signs. This is my Miller, and I now want to move on to Bourke-White. I call this always the first because that characterizes her war effort. As I mentioned already, she was the first female war correspondent to fly combat missions in flying fortresses. This is a picture that became a famous pin-up, and she was very proud that for a few months she was a pin-up before she was then displaced by Betty Grable, which she felt was, Betty Grable was a better pin-up. Nevertheless, here she is standing in front of her first flight mission in a suit that was made only for her. And the way that Life publishes it, this is why it's interesting to look at the photographs also in the way that they were initially brought into circulation, because it's the same thing as with Lee Miller. This is Life's Bourke-White goes a bombing. That is to say, at least 50% of the news is not that they're bombing, but that she is on that bomber plane bombing with them. And the anecdote about how she got herself into this position is interesting as well, because she was able to overcome military prejudice against women in combat airplanes, because she was on they wouldn't let her take a plane, so then she had to take a ship to Tunis. The ship was, quote unquote, luckily torpedoed by the Germans. This was in December 44, and she ended up in a lifeboat with a brigade of nurses. General Doolittle, a commander of the U.S. Air Force, was so impressed with her iron will that he decided if she can survive a German U-boat attack, she's probably going to survive anything. She'd already written a book called Shooting the Russian War, and I'll show you something of that in a moment. And she continued to send photographs to Life. She also published another book during the war from the Italian front lines. But it's interesting looking at the photo essay, Women in Lifeboats, which prompted her into this position, because we have once again this interface I'm so interested in between war correspondence, advertisement, and celebrity images. This is the famous image that accompanies the description first of how they were attacked, and then the 8 hours they spent on the water, and then finally the rescue. And they're all looking up into the sky because they're now seeing the airplane that's going to rescue them. This was so famous that it influenced Hitchcock when he made Lifeboat. He literally, I mean, obviously in Lifeboat there aren't quite so many people on the lifeboat, but it's the same attitude looking up. And in fact, I can't show you this today because then I would have run out of time. But if you look at Lifeboat again, the character Constance Parker, played by Tallulah Bankhead, is based on Bourke-White. Did you know this film? You must know this film with the furs and the. I mean, she used to travel that way with like 6 cameras and I don't know how many other. It was very important that she had a powder box with her. She emphasizes this. Anyway, this is what I want to show you because again, I'm interested in the mise en page. If you look what they did. We have first that famous image, and then a kind of top shot so that we understand what that looks like. But then we have an image of her with her hot cocoa. Then we have her text, and then if you turn the page, this is what you get. First, an advertisement. Matthew, I think that's going to make you happy. Fine Arts Whiskey. Then a continuation of the text, and then we have this page. And this page says there's a new glamour girl in Hollywood. It's an advertisement for Boeing. The image is taken from Howard Hawks's film Air Force, in which the B-17 plays, a real B-17 plays a major role. These are all actors. And so what you get here is very strange. The glamour girl is the Boeing, but this is another glamour girl, though not in Hollywood. We're moving from a real event to her representation of that real event to a real Boeing in a film which is a historical reimagination of the campaign to regain the Philippines. And all of that feeds back into both consumerism, we're selling whiskey, and we are trying to get the Americans to buy war bonds so that the government can buy more Boeings. And all of this is also part of celebrity culture. This is the kind of thing I'm intrigued by. Typical for Bourke-White is this mixture of professional ambition and empathy, and this is something that we see particularly in the Russia book. And I can only give you, bits and pieces, but I want to just focus on one moment. This is a book that she wrote in 1941. It was published early 42, so while she was writing it, the Americans were not yet in the war by the time the book came out, called Shooting, where is it now? Shooting, I'm sorry, I can't find that right now. They were in the war already. So what she was then writing about Russia looks very different because they were really military allies at that point. She was, as I say, they're always where the men are not. She was the only person in Moscow when the Nazis attacked. This is the way there's several. Sorry, I need to just say that these books, they're a collection of photos, essays, and then her articles. And she has several on bomb raids, but the first one begins like this. The opening air raids over Moscow possessed a magnificence that I have never seen matched in any other man-made spectacle. It was as though the German pilots and the Russian anti-aircraft gunners had been handed enormous brushes dipped in radiant paint and were executing abstract designs with the sky as their vast canvas. This is, I think, and this is what she does, yeah? And throughout that book, and this is very typical for Bourke-White, she writes about how iron-willed she is, how she hides underneath the bed so that the guard can't take her off to the bomb shelter. She talks about how she has to stay with her cameras even if it's dangerous because she doesn't want to lose them. And in fact, she even talks about how she forces people not to take away shattered glass until she's able to take her perfect photograph of this. But she's also the one who keeps emphasizing how painful it is for the war photographer to actually experience what they're experiencing, and how photographing is a way for her to protect herself against this. So there's a scene at the Russian front where she watches a woman realize that her daughter is dead in a barn, and she says, "It's a peculiar thing about pictures of this sort. It's as though a protecting screen draws itself across my mind and makes it possible to consider focus and light values and the technique of photography. This blind lasts as long as it is needed while I'm actually operating the camera." And even afterwards, she says, when she looks at the negatives after she's developed them, it's almost painful for her because she's living in a double time, much as Lee Miller is living in a double time. She's looking at the images and she affectively re-experiences the pain of the situation. So here's my third woman. I hope that you're not completely fatigued yet. No? Can we still go on? Okay. Martha Gellhorn. That obsession with the war. Martha Gellhorn was already a star. After her stardom begins as she's reporting the Spanish Civil War for Collier's. And what's important to me, because I want to show you some clips from a film which I am assuming no one but you, Jackie, knows. Arise, My Love. Has anyone seen that? Oh, but you have. Oh, this is good. I'm very happy. I'm very happy. It's true. Tom Conley told me about this. Otherwise, I wouldn't know this either. She was such a celebrity. Arise, My Love, 1940, film by Mitchell Lyson, and it's one of the very few films, classic Hollywood films, in fact, Hollywood films I found about women correspondents. I think there may be 3 in all. And I want to show you a few scenes from that film. To illustrate to you her celebrity before she even enters the Second World War. And what I'm also taken with, of course, is the fact that Augusta Nash, that's the war correspondent based on Martha Gellhorn, is played by Claudette Colbert. So the story is the following. Augusta Nash has been writing fashion columns, which is true for Martha Gellhorn as well. She doesn't want to continue doing that, so she comes up with this incredible ruse. She's working for the Associated News out of Paris. She's going to pretend she's the wife of a pilot who's in a Franco prison in order to get him out. She does get him out, and I'm particularly interested in the way, and Billy Wilder is the screenwriter on this, the resilience of the female war correspondent that he comes up with.
We hit in the clouds, a sanctuary of whipped cream.
Is that the sort of stuff you write, Augusta? Well, why don't you rewrite your name, Augusta, when you talk to a battleship?
Well, they called it Gusto. For years I had a column in Paris with Gusto.
You've not seen it someplace?
No. It's a fashion column. Flash. Chiffon makes a comeback. Flash. Suzanne scoops scum corsets.
Don't tell me this story's going to be what the well-dressed fugitive is wearing.
No, sirree. From now on, it's front page features for me, with a byline, syndicated and copyrighted.
You're not going to write right now.
Well, right now it's right. I'm not ready for the first French telegraph office we strike. Now, come on. Thomas Martin. What was that middle name of yours?
Thomas Fuller Martin, often known as Thomas Fuller Malarkey.
I'll bet. What's that for?
Just wanted to hear if they're around. Well, those planes have Crystal weak gas supply. We got just about a 50-50 chance of making the border.
Do you mind if I write 1 chance in 1,000?
But why not be practical? Either we're caught and you've written that stuff for nothing, or we land in France and you've got all the time in the world.
Well?
Well, it's going to be our last hour. Why not spend it like sensible people?
For instance?
You might move over and kiss a lobe of my hair. Now, it's a funny thing that you of all people should be sitting beside me. You're precisely my type.
Mm-hmm. How long were you in that prison?
10 months. As I was saying, first girl I was crazy about, I went to Cleveland Show and I was something like you. Or take Hazel, for instance. Hazel was the air hostess on a commercial line I was flying from Fort Worth to New Orleans.
Okay, I'm going to stop it here because this goes on for a while. He tries to kiss her. That is not successful, but what is successful is they do get to Paris. And I just want to show you what it looks like when they land in Paris, because the star is not our rescued pilot, but the woman who rescued him. See that?
Come on, you athletic.
The heroine, Augusta Nash, and her photograph in the news. This is what it does to me. Okay. Bond market steady with rail readers. I don't do that.
Come on, you athletic slugs. The train's already in. They're firing. Hold it, Gusto. Stay where you are, Martin. Come on, boys. Step on it. Okay? Stop. Ready on the words? Okay. Miss Nash, as European head of the Associated News, it is my great privilege to welcome you after an exploit as brilliant as it was daring. You have thrilled the hearts of millions of readers with your story, which appeared exclusively through the Associated News in 400 papers throughout the world. Congratulations, Miss Nash.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. I'm glad I was able to do my bit for a fellow American and the Associated News.
So this is the way she's being set up as a celebrity, and now, indeed, she does get to cover Berlin, but because we are, I mean, this is before they have attacked France. But we're in the realm of melodrama, so what instead we get is this love story between the two, at the height of which they decide, because they're deluded by love, they have to return to America. And as so often in Hollywood films, thank God, the real breaks in. In this particular case, it's a German torpedo, which torpedoes the ship that is about to take them to America. So thank God they can't go to America. Instead, they have to stay in Europe. She becomes, and this is the scene I want to show you, she becomes the great war correspondent. He becomes, flies with the, he goes and joins the Air Force. I can't remember which one now, and becomes a very valiant airplane, does many valiant airplane combat missions. I'm interested in the way that the within a sequence of a couple seconds, you're going to see, we see one after the other of the frontline pages with her stories in them. And what Lyson does, typical for the time, he mixes a kind of fictional situation with documentary material. And you'll see at the end, the byline is no longer Augusta Nash, but an Augusta Nash international female correspondent. So this is really a visual staging of the birth of her as a star correspondent.
Julius H. is carried. Why didn't you say so? Augusta Nash was on the Athenia. You sweetheart, you darling, I always said you had a nose for news. What a break!
Yes, wasn't it? A wreck like this doesn't come once in 1,000 years, I guess. Put on the stenographers, will you?
Sure, darling. Get on the phones, you sluts. Look, bring back all the good photographs you can pick up. And get back here as soon as you can. There's a bonus waiting for you. Okay, Gaston, give out, baby, everything you know. At the first terrific explosion, huge water spout jumped 70 feet above ship. Came down on the lifeboats, washing half away.
While the remaining lifeboats were being filled with women and children, another shell carried away the mainmast. It was evidently aimed at the wireless room, but missed its mark.
It ends with her voice, and that's interesting if you think of this in connection with Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, where it is the man in the studio who appeals to the American audience. The lights are out in Europe. We need you. In this film, it is her voice that ultimately compels the pilot who has been shot at and thinks he's worth nothing anymore. She says, no, we have to go back to America. We have had this experience here. In America, we can rally the troops, etc., etc. As I just want to say, it's important to me that Billy Wilder should have given this voice of appeal, of direct appeal to the audience, which is literally speaking not just to him on the diegetic level, but to the audience, that he should have given it to the war correspondent, female war correspondent, because we have not really seen that before. There is an interesting, I feel I need to show you this. This is extremely disturbing to me, but also very interesting. The other film about Gellhorn, I couldn't find anything but these two. It was 1912. This is Philip Kaufman, and here Nicole Kidman plays Martha Gellhorn. This is what, in the age of digital filming, you can do. Rather than just having a kind of montage where our actress and documentary material are fused together, in the age of digital filming, our actress literally becomes part of the documentary image. Have you seen this one? Okay, you're in for a treat. This is now Martha Gellhorn reporting on D-Day.
There was talk everywhere that the invasion was going to happen. And my problem with no connections was how to be there when it did.
Where are you going? Where are you going?
Oh, I'm doing a story on nurses, the college.
Good luck, Wally. You're off.
So I stood on the hospital ship. People will be writing about this site for 100 years, and whoever saw it will never forget it. After the first shock of wonder and admiration, one began to look around and see separate details. A
also a mixture. If you look at the reportage, it's all over the place what they're doing here.
Everyone's violently busy on that crowded, dangerous shore. The dust that rose seemed like the fog of war itself. There was
Sorry. Don't worry, we're going to fast forward here. The art, here we go. That's what I want you to see.
the dust that rose seemed like the fog of war itself. There was a terrible feeling of working against time.
There were wounded who groaned in their sleep or called out. And there was the soft, steady hum of conversation among the wounded who could not sleep. Stop. It was a ship carrying a load of pain. But we were together, and we counted on each other. Stop.
So you see them repeating the previous film with information, but what's also interesting is that this is Nicole Kidman on the cover of Collier's. In fact, whether he really stole her assignment or not seems to be a little unclear, but definitely there was never a Collier's with Martha Gellhorn on the cover. The point was that Hemingway was on the cover and she was kind of hidden inside the magazine. So it's a bizarre authentication and at the same time really creative accounting going on here. Okay, as a way of kind of pulling it together, they all end up together in Germany. And if I were a filmmaker or if I were something else, I'd write a screenplay about these women meeting up again and again, but again, above all in Germany. There are photographs that we see them. And I just want to give you a few sound bites and then one scene for what I'm interested in. Martha Gellhorn writes, "I was in Dachau when the German army surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The same half-naked skeleton who had been dug out of the death train shuffled back into the doctor's office. He said something in Polish. His voice was no stronger than a whisper. The Polish doctor clapped his hands gently and said, 'Bravo.' I asked what they are talking about. 'The war is over,' the doctor said. 'Germany is defeated.' We sat in that room, in that accursed cemetery prison, and no one had anything more to say. Still, Dachau seemed to me the most suitable place in Europe to hear the news of victory. For surely this war was made to abolish Dachau and all the other places like Dachau and everything that Dachau stood for and to abolish it forever." And even as she brings this, in this wonderful vignette, the whole pain and happiness and inability really to comment, she's very quick to critique everyone else, that is to say the whole military apparatus, because she then adds what in hindsight unfortunately is too optimistic. "We must know now that there can never be peace if there is cruelty like this in the world, and if ever again we tolerate such cruelty, we have no right to peace." Lee Miller herself recalls that during the spring of 45, she was enveloped in a wall of hate and disgust, that for months she was just staring blindly and her mouth was tightly shut. And in one of her essays, she even says, "I begrudge the Germans the cherries on the trees." But at the same time, she's had no problem commemorating all the horror that she saw in the concentration camps that all three correspondents visited after V-Day. And in fact, and this is what I want to show you, she writes a telegram after she photographed Bourke-White to her editor, Audrey Withers. This is the telegram: "I implore you to believe this is true." And she adds that she hopes that Vogue would not shy away from publishing what she had for them. Both British and American Vogue published her text. It was, however, only American Vogue that chose this layout. The British Vogue wanted to be a little bit more jubilatory. This is the V-Day edition of the American Vogue. We have here her text on Germany, and here the visual analogy between, on the one hand, the symmetry of the ovens and the prisoners, and here the civilians who, after the war, said, "Oh, we were never Nazis, we never knew anything." Turn it over, and this is what you get. On the one hand, her statement, believe it, Lee Miller cables from Germany, and again a visual analogy, on the one hand the piles of corpses, and on the other hand a guard who hangs himself. I was, as I say, intrigued to find not only photographs that show how these women find themselves meeting up again and again, but also that both Bourke-White and Lee Miller were in Leipzig when the city capitulated, and in the town hall they found a very strange scene of death, which both of them photographed, and I'm assuming at the same time. I mean, I can't imagine that those corpses were lying around for many hours. And so it's interesting to look at the difference between how the two of them photograph and describe the exact same scene. This is Bourke-White, and this is Lee Miller. Bourke-White calls her report, "Death seemed the only escape," and you can say that there's a kind of clinical description of the scene. She says, "On the ponderous leather furniture was a family group so intimate, so lifelike, that it was hard to realize that these people were no longer living. Seated at the desk, head bowed on his hands as though he were resting, was Dr. Kurt Liesel. On the sofa was his daughter, and in the overstuffed armchair sat his wife. The documents for the whole family were laid out neatly on the desk beside the bottle of Pyramol by which they had evidently chosen to die." For her, this is a kind of Madame Tussaud wax cabinet scene. And again, you see she's taking it from top, from the balustrade. She's taking a certain distance. If you remember the image of the Moscow air raid, she's also interested in a certain visual pattern, if you like. At the same time, she is morally indignant and says, "These people were representative of the men and women who have been personally responsible for many evils of fascism. And when their pyramid of mounting brutalities had begun to slide down on them," so you see the poetic language that she uses, "in that last dizzy downhill coast, they were still well-fed, well-clothed, housed in comfortable, luxurious buildings. Their final look on the world must have been a dramatic one, with the Volkssturm and the Wehrmacht preparing a last defense below their office windows, fourth-floor windows high enough for the unimpeded view of American tanks and doughboys storming toward their refuge." If you look at Lee Miller, you can see she's much closer to the scene. And this is the way that she does, and especially because she does a second picture where she turns, looking at the lighting, you can see how she turns the daughter into a kind of surrealist cadavre exquise. She writes, "The love of death, which is the underpattern of the German living, caught up with the high officials of the regime, and they gave a great party, toasted death and Hitler, and poisoned themselves. In one of the offices, a gray-haired man sits with his head bowed on his crossed hands on the desk. Opposite him, sprawled in a chair, is a faded woman, eyes open and a trickle of blood dried on her chin. But what she's particularly interested in are tiny little details that turn this political tragedy into a kind of Baroque drama of self-expenditure, because she says about the woman, this one, "Leaning back on the sofa is a girl with extraordinary pretty teeth, waxen and dusty. Her nurse's uniform is sprinkled with plaster from the battle for the city hall, which raged outside after their deaths." And this is called Nazi Harvest, and was later included by Penrose in shows on martyrdom. Martha Gellhorn is equally unforgiving in Faces of War, which is a collection of her war essays she published in the 80s. She writes, "War was always worse than I knew how to say, always. And probably from an instinct of self-preservation, one tried to write most often of what was brave and decent. Perhaps now my articles on Germany and on the behavior of the Gestapo, the SS, and other sections of the German army will seem untimely paeans of hate. I report what I saw, and hate was the only reaction such sight could produce. We have before us the memory and the lesson. Let us not imagine that anyone can use frightfulness in a good cause." And so I thought I'd like to finish just by telling you how those three women came home, because they illustrate, in a sense, the three different attitudes that I've been describing for you. Lee Miller's surrealist gaze, who found in the horrors of death that war produces a kind of strangely macabre beauty. Bourke-White, who is interested in looking at the patterns of destruction, and Gellhorn, who foregrounds this idea of an empathetic indignation. Gellhorn, if it was her marriage to Hemingway that in a sense was part of her celebrity during the 30s, when she came home from the war, Hemingway claimed she was too ambitious and too war crazy, and so they divorced. She would continue to write about wars until the end of her life. Java for Saturday Evening Post, wrote for The Guardian on Vietnam and Israel, The New Statesman on Latin America, and became more and more critical of the arms race and more in sympathy with international peace movements, but continued to insist, as she then again writes in Faces of War, that the point of her articles is that they're true insofar as she tells what she saw. Perhaps they will remind others as they remind me of the face of war. We can hardly be reminded too much or too often. I believe that memory and imagination, not nuclear weapons, are the great deterrents, and I would say that's extremely timely for where we are at the moment. Margaret Bourke-White came home and published under the title Dear Fatherland, Rest Quietly, her report about the collapse of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, and she was incredibly, there's this amazing amount of egoism in her, which I kind of like about her. She was terribly proud that her chapters on Krupp were used during the Nuremberg trials, and that Alfred Krupp had to stand up in the courtroom while passages, long passages that she'd written about him, were read out loud. And she continued to, she went for Life magazine to report about Gandhi, about apartheid in South Africa. She covered the Korean War, and it was there that she discovered that she had Parkinson's. And in a sense, I mean, the last piece of writing she did was an autobiography where she brings together all her war writings and comments on them, and you have her as this kind of resilient woman willing to face all hindrances, even if it's her own physical disability. But the one that moved me most, I have to say, is Lee Miller's return to civil life, because it's quite clear that she returned from the front deeply traumatized at a time when there was no language for war trauma. I mean, neither for men nor for women. She became horribly alcoholic, I assume. She married Ronald Penrose and moved to their house in Essex, and by the mid-50s she'd completely given up all work as a photojournalist and as a fashion photographer. She would not respond to requests that part of her work could be included in exhibitions or book publications, and she said, and I think it's such an incredibly good formulation, she said the war destroyed everything. And the war had, in a sense, destroyed everything, and so she claimed that her work as a war correspondent was negligible, that she wanted people to forget that that's what she had done, and instead she lived in this house. She took cooking lessons with I don't know what the big French cooking school was, and she would give these incredibly extravagant parties for her former artist friends, and did a lot of drinking. But she never gave up this incredible hatred she had for the Germans. And if a friend of hers married a German, she said, I'm not talking to that person anymore. So it was like she was holding on to something from the war, even as she really insisted on downplaying her role in that war. And it's really only, and this is what is, it's a common story, but I find it a moving story. It's really only after she died that her son's wife discovered in the attic boxes and boxes and boxes of text and of photographs. And that's when they realized the enormous archive of material that in fact exists over and beyond what was published at the time in Vogue. And in fact, they've begun to, as you know, in the various shows on Lee Miller, they've begun to bring more material out. There is clearly even more material lying in Sussex. And again, the son says it's really only as he's looking at all of this material that he understood what kind of a serious moral commitment his mother had to the war. And that, for me, makes me think, of course, the political world today and the world of news reporting is different today. But my thinking, and I take this idea from Mieke Baal when she talks about preposterous history, that you look at history through its subsequent recyclings. And so I'm interested in saying, through the subsequent recyclings we've had, either directly or implicitly, about these three women, and the many women war correspondents we have now, we might have another access both to these three women, and this is what I've been testing in the last few months as I've been talking to people while putting together this book. Much of this material is not known. People may know Lee Miller or they may know Gellhorn, but they tend not to know all three. And I find bringing them into conversation with each other, given that they were in conversation with each other. I mean, Lee Miller photographs them. They meet up. I mean, that's my fantasy. They meet in the Hotel Scribe. They drink champagne and talk, after they've just been 5 months in the mud. It may give, I'm now speaking for someone who's living on the continent where we're so obsessed with this war, may give another perspective on the Second World War if you look at it through these women, because they never hid the horror of it, but at the same time, it was also about them, about staging them. So this is a little bit like my other obsession is Marlene Dietrich, of course, who was drinking champagne with them in the Hotel Scribe as well, in my fantasy. That the way that they can also turn that into a moment of self-empowerment as women in the particular field that they're in. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a fabulous lecture. We've got some time for questions, comments. Can I open it up? And maybe before you speak, you could say who you are so that we know who's in there. I'd like to, yeah.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. So great to see some of those wonderful photos again and have your take on it. And I love the idea of them meeting up as well. And I want to eavesdrop into that conversation. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the sort of the spectacle of the feminine in this, because there's such an interesting period for the sort of militarization of women's bodies on the one hand through wearing uniforms and being in the auxiliary services. It's a period in which women are mass mobilized. They're not the only women who are mobilized in a sense, mobilized through militarized forces. But this is the era of Rosie the Riveter and all these sort of spectacles of the militarized female body. And then you've got some of these photographs where they're sort of shifting between themselves posing in very much masculine gear, masculine attire, really putting that, but then also wearing lipstick. And so you've got this uneasy tension between the feminine and the masculine.
I think I can only add on to that, but I think that's exactly it. And I have, if you invoke Rosie the Riveter, now I don't have that in that PowerPoint, but you probably know that image. And what's important with that image for me is, she's this big muscular lady and she's wearing that uniform, but she has the powder thing in her. So it's important. And I say that because, what I have also done for different publication, I was interested in women soldiers. And I found that there is a vast amount of women after Jeanne d'Arc until the mid-19th century who cross-dressed as soldiers. Often people knew they were women, but they didn't care. And I was interested in that as a way that it then feeds into the fashion designing of the 30s and 40s. And so there are quite a few images, and here the British and the American photography is slightly different. There are lots and lots of wonderful images of women in the auxiliary forces in Britain. They're very stylish. They tend to be more masculine, however, overall, including your lovely queen. She was an auto mechanic during the war, right? The Americans, they put makeup on these women. They stage them so they will have red socks matching the red lipstick and usually holding like a red canister. They look like Bette Davises. Intriguing for me is that they sometimes bring black and white women together in those images. They're glamorizing the war effort there because they had to get 6 million women to decide to leave wherever they lived and move to the coast. This is the beginning of childcare, for example, in the US as well. And I think the Americans emphasize the glamoring of the war, perhaps more, but always, I'm thinking of one short now where, one film short, where it's all about the costumes that they have to wear, and then she puts on the overall, and then you see this is all massive, that she has to open this up, so that we see a little bit of chest. The way I understood that was that there was quite a lot of resistance, not just for the women to move into these jobs, but for the men to accept that. And so feminizing what was actually very masculine was a cover-up. That's why I talk not just about femininity as a masquerade, but masculinity as a masquerade as well. And my sense with these war photographers is that partially it's because that's the way they are, but partially because they realize if I bring in a clash between the two and even underline it, Lee Miller in my suit, but then I see her horrified, and then I see her again beautifully posed, it almost enhances my power than if I were just the one or the other. So, but what that also means is you could say, I haven't worked on that yet, but that may be a way to go, that what the kind of watershed moment that I've been talking about also has something to do with the fixing of gender. Because in fact, or the unfixing of gender really, because in fact, if you look at the material on Rosie the Riveters, this is a moment where things are possible that have not been possible for women before. It's the classes, the ethnicities, many different types of women come together in these factories that would not have come together in the factories before, and they forge bonds that then are in a sense suppressed throughout the 50s, but then erupt again in the 60s. And I think the blurring of clear gender boundaries is one of them. The Russians look very different. The Russian women with the Kalashnikovs. But by the 50s, that's forbidden in Russia. So it's like something is possible and then it's covered up again.
It ties in very much with what you've just been saying, actually. I'm thinking about what do you think about the men's reactions to these women? I'm thinking about two things. In the film, Arise My Love, the bit you didn't show is the plaster on his nose, which kind of emasculates him, doesn't it? But then she is the person who rips it off, and he's got the plaster on his nose because, as I understand it, she bit him because as
he tries to kiss her and she bites him.
And she'd said to him in the plane that she'd bit somebody else on the nose because he'd approached her. So on the one hand, here is this film representing her as a sort of ball breaker, really.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other shot we saw is Margaret Bourke-White on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And the men looking at her, it's very interesting. I mean, they can't make her out. They can't situate her, can they?
That's right.
Could you say something about those
two
reactions?
And that was Lee Miller, but okay. No, and as I say, the licensed film, because it's Hollywood and because it is war propaganda, they have to contain what they're also bringing out. They're bringing out female empowerment. They also make her the voice of conscience, but they also have to contain that. That's why we have the love melodrama. She bites him in the nose. She is gutsy, but then she does fall in love for him. She's willing to give everything up, but then, thank God, history intervenes. And so it's a kind of, you could call it fetishism. I know, but nevertheless, we know that they're empowered, but in fact, we have to pretend that we can contain them, because otherwise, whereas the Lee Miller photograph, that's one of the very few, it's not taken by Sherman. It's one of the few that shows her in her, I don't want to say her ugliness, but in her horror. There's nothing beautiful about her there. On the contrary, she looks worn and almost monstrous herself, faced with the monstrosity she's seeing. The men are guiding looking at her, she's looking somewhere else. So she's kind of between, Bach talks about how the extremes on both ends then at some point touch. And she's becoming the horror that she's looking at, and she's like she doesn't even fit into any visualization of her. This is not a shot that Vogue would have used. It's not a shot that anyone would have used. It's one of the material there. So probably most of the time that's what they looked like. But what they're representing is something else. And I agree with you. That's why I really wanted to show that, because it doesn't even look like Lee Miller, really. Yeah.
Question there and then. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your reading of the staging of some of those photographs, especially the ones Lee Miller took. And I just wondered, in terms of, you talked about framing a lot, and I just wondered especially with Miller and Gellhorn, how much do you think they were kind of, because you talked about celebrity as well, so how much do you think they were framed by their famous husbands, and kind of what does that do to, the gendering of those photographs, if that is another framing device?
I mean, Gellhorn, I think, was literally framed in the American sense, with Hemingway upstaging her all the time, and her, in a sense, having to fight against Hemingway. That's why I think it's so ironic that at the end of the war, he says she's war crazy and ambitious, which is what I would say Hemingway was. But when you look at, when you read her texts, I just couldn't present enough of those here, but when you read those texts, and she's the one who really breaks all the rules. So, Bourke-White's the good one. That they're the ones, she gets accredited, she gets to do what she likes, because she really plays by the rules. Gellhorn's the one who really does not play by the rules, and she keeps getting, what they do in football, they give you the red card, or, But then she just finds people who are somewhat kind. She says, the Americans were so difficult, so I went off to Italy and I moved with the French. And then, by 44, no one cared anymore, so I was moving with the Americans again. And she is vicious in her attack on the high command, and she makes fun of their language. There's a text by her on the bulge, for example, where she says, bulge being ironed out, well, it was ironed out by your men and women, and they're dead now. So I would say, if at all, then she emphasizes this kind of empathetic view. That's why she also says, I liked visiting hospitals, and keeps driving home. We're paying for this. This is costing us lives and pain, and I want you to look at that. It's as though perhaps feeling framed by her husband, who's so different, Hemingway, loves the kick of the thrill of it. It's like she's writing exactly against that. That's what I would say for Gellhorn. With Lee Miller, I think it's different. I haven't looked enough into this very, very troubled biography. I think that she was a somewhat unstable person. And she was quite lucky that British Vogue allowed her to do what it allowed her to do. But she basically was on a blacklist because she'd been so terribly irresponsible. I don't know how famous Anthony Penrose would have been. I had never heard of him before.
The whole family are quite famous as radical scientists.
But were they
Bloomsbury Edge? Yeah.
At the time?
Yeah.
I was also thinking of Man Ray,
Okay, and Steichen, etc. Okay, well here I would say she is using that, but at the same time working against that radically, and that's why that photograph of her in Saint-Malo is so important. Because on the one hand you see her, there's a photograph of her naked underneath a net, which are the protective nets. And so she's still using her body, her beautiful body, but is connecting that with war paraphernalia. So that's kind of continuing in the vein. And I know that when the show was on in London, I don't know who said that, but I got very angry when the journalist told me this, because there's a Lee Miller show on in Vienna now, where this one journalist said she should just have continued to work as a model, because not a single one of the photographs that she did is as valuable as what was made of her. I just find it extraordinary. No one can say something like that. So she must herself have been aware of this, there's an iconic idea of who Lee Miller is, and although she'd been doing so much interesting fashion photography in the 30s, she was still put into the camp, beautiful woman, Man Ray model, Steichen model, blah, blah, blah model. And that's why I have the feeling she kind of got into this war, and then she suddenly starts writing, which she hadn't done before. This is the work she did for Vogue is the only writing that she did for the war. she's on the battlefield all the time, with following all these troops, being in places where she shouldn't be, and then coming up with ideas how to get to other places where she shouldn't be. Here, well, maybe you could. It's hard, you know. It's all speculation. I can only deal with what I have, and the texts I'm reading are incredibly poetic, and they're incredibly well crafted, and they really draw you into the scenes of war. In a way that one wouldn't even have imagined. That, you know, before that you would have thought of her a little bit as a surrealist party girl, right? Then you see that there's something else in her there, and yeah, probably writing against her image as well, but also in her case so passionately anti-fascist, yeah, that I'm not sure how much of that was really conscious and how much of that was just there's this opportunity and I really need to do that. And it was Sherman who suggested to her. You know, the Americans have started, 44, the American military started to accredit women before they hadn't. Why don't you get yourself accredited as war correspondent? And I mean, the other thing one can never leave out of the equation, and Gellhorn is probably the only one who talks about that explicitly, as does Marlene Dietrich. This was an incredible adventure for these women. I mean, you know, there's the interview she does with Swedish television, Marlene Dietrich, 1972, and she's and he asks her about this, and she says, it was a hard time, but it was wonderful. You know, we can't imagine that.
Yes, I was really interested. At one point you talked a little bit about censorship, and particularly I think it was with Lee Miller, how she'd taken a photo of the bomb explosion, that's right, and how the military wasn't very happy with
No.
that.
Yeah.
These three women have when they were embedding with the troops, so to speak.
Right. Well, actually, even Bourke-White makes funny comments about censors. Like she gets stuck on a road in Russia, and then the censor comes and tells the other people, "Let that woman." She starts crying, and then the censor comes and says, "You know, to get her to stop crying, let's just stay with her. We're going to move on to Moscow and let her get her pictures." She said, "Well, then at least for once, the censor was good for something." So there are ironic comments about that throughout. Everything was censored, which is to say, begins. I mean, first of all, you couldn't get your gear unless you were accredited. I mean, I'm sure there were. I don't know about them. Civilians who were also photographing and writing. But in order to get your gear, your costume, your Jeep, or not even your Jeep, but your card, you had to be accredited by. That's already a form of censorship. Then everything that was sent, whether it was photographs or whether it was text, because it was published in journals, in magazines or journals, went through the Pentagon. And in fact, Bourke-White is the one who made a deal with the Pentagon. She said, "Okay, fine, you can use my photographs if we can also print them in life." So that everything was censored. And in fact, afterwards, I've read a couple of books on war correspondence in general. Afterwards, they laugh about it. In 1945, when they start reporting about something, they're like, yeah, but where's the censor now? There's no censor here to read what we have written. We're even missing the censor. This is different from Vietnam, where that's not. But I think one has to always remind ourselves that Vietnam is the anomaly, where you could photograph anything you wanted, write anything, and were most likely to find a place that would publish that. So all the material went through the Pentagon before it even showed up on any pages. And then there was a further form of censorship, namely what the editor would do with it. And I think it's a great credit to Vogue that they place these images and the way they place the images and the way they put the titles to circumvent any possible other censorship. So it's on many stages you had the censorship. And in the Second World War, they accepted that. They felt this is worth it because we are all in support of the cause, even if we are extremely critical of the military organization. And Gellhorn, I mean, on the ground, of course, Gellhorn is the one who Miller, the military says, "You're staying in your room now. You can't leave your room." So she doesn't stay in her room. She just goes somewhere else. Gellhorn is told, we're not allowing you to move with this troop, then they just find another group of troops that will take them. So they can subvert it that way. And another form of censorship that they were fighting against, the men, not only were male journalists allowed to fly combat missions early on, but they allowed some of the most prestigious male journalists to be in on the briefings. So D-Day, for example, I don't know how many, but they had 60 cameras. I'm making up the numbers now, but it's a lot. 500 journalists. They were parachuting down cameramen and other technical people the night before, along with all of the airborne that they parachuted down the night before D-Day invasion, so that they were already on the beach when and this is extraordinary in this sense, it was an enormous media event. They lost most of that footage. And what you saw in the Hemingway Gellhorn film is pretty much all there is of moving images. But they were all men. And they would include them in I'm saying hard to imagine today, but they would include them in the preparatory briefings in order to even think about, okay, so if we're going to invade here now, how could we best strategically, but that was only the men, so the censorship there against the women was they were not, I mean, while they did get the jeeps and the uniforms and the press cards, they were not let into that inner circle, and that's what I'm saying, they found other things, and then she happened, and no one was supposed to be in Saint-Malo, as we can imagine now, because they were testing napalm. That's why none of the men were there, but there was Lee Miller.
I wanted to ask one final question, and then we'll close. Can you talk a little bit about the way, the sort of visibility of the technology in the stagings, and the way that there's a sort of tension between the witnessing, but also the sort of high visibility of the forms of mediation and the kinds of point of view that affords, or the way in which the technology foregrounds point of view in a way, as well as giving us this feeling that we're witnessing via the war correspondent. There's a sort of tension, I think, between the presence of the technology and the feeling of presence and witnessing.
You mean in the photographs and the films?
Well, I noticed it particularly in the photographs, the way in which the technology was so much part of the staging.
I mean, Bourke-White, I can only, maybe we are going to get a deal, I can only say Bourke-White is extraordinary. There's one scene, I hope this is an oblique answer, and then I'll try to answer even more directly. There's an incredible scene where she describes, she's on a mountain, or a hill, in North Italy, and she wants to photograph an aerial attack. In order to do that, she needs 4 cameras and she needs 4 flashbulbs, or maybe she needs 1 camera but 4 differently positioned flashbulbs, all to go off at the same time. So she's able to convince the GIs, because I mean, you know, there's a woman, especially Bourke-White, is tall and kind of attractive in a certain way, insistent. She then tells them, okay, you know, you are going to do this one. So she has to bring up all the cables, and she has to set, so this is really incredibly complicated, because this isn't just me and my cell phone. These are heavy cameras, heavy lenses, and she needs the light. And then at one point they say to her, you know, Peggy, this is going to be too complicated, because if you want us to flash the bulbs at exactly the time that we're also flashing the gun when you're pressing your camera, why don't you do it at the same time? Why don't you just say, ready, go, fire, and then when you say fire, we press our things, we press the gun, you press the camera. This is what they then did. Then some general comes along at some point, and in the midst of all of it, this is the way she describes it in that book. So she's herself foregrounding the technology. That's why I'm telling the story. So he comes in, and there's so many people running around with cables and with flashlights and whatever, that at this point she doesn't even notice that he's a general. So she kind of gives them another flashlight. And at some point she says, there, I was giving the commands, and he was flashing my light bulbs. So I think that they're actually themselves commenting on the fact that, first of all, it's cumbersome, but also, for example, the aerial photography, which they don't do, but which we have. I mean, as you know, the cameras, whether they were cameras or movie cameras or photo cameras, they were right next to the bomb sites, and they were taking all this footage, not necessarily for news media, but as reconnaissance work. And so you're seeing the bombs drop. A, they want to know, did we hit something or not? B, what else do we see down there? But we're also seeing the bomb drop. And I got interested in all of that because when I looked at a lot of the films that are made from 1942 to into the early 50s, but particularly in the 40s, you will have studio set cut. You will get documentary material or newsreel material cut back to the studio. The grain is different. Mm-hmm. And yet, you know, it's A, how were they going to do that otherwise? B, it gives authenticity to it, or they'll use it as the rear projection to Robert Mitchum standing in front in a boat. But it also makes us see this is cinema, or this is filmed, this is reproduction. And my thinking with Lee Miller here really is that when she frames things the way she frames them, she wants us to be aware of the fact that this isn't just a snapshot, but that this is a clearly composed image to emphasize precisely the fact that it's not, what shall I say? It's not, I can only say it's not a snapshot. It's because there can be no snapshot. I mean, that it needs a certain framing, it needs a certain distancing in order to even be comprehensible.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for sharing your extraordinary archive with us and giving us this route through. It was really wonderful to listen to. And there is a wine reception over at Cafe Muse. Please come and have a glass of wine. I feel, given the temperature in the Sledge Theatre, should really be offering you hot chocolate.
No.
But there is wine, so come and join us. But thank you so much.